"That's not looking too bad, shipman," Rook Tuzma commented, walking up from behind Cheetah with his typical awkward, lumbering steps. Cheetah strongly resisted the urge to give back any sort of sarcastic remark on the matter. Of course it didn't look too bad. She was just securing cargo for deceleration. It really wasn't a masterclass in complicated work. And besides, she'd done it hundreds of times before, even as a cadet and apprentice. Not that she felt like she was above it now. Everyone had to do it. But getting a pat on the back for it felt patronizing at best. Still, ever since starting to serve under Rook Tuzma's supervision a few months ago, she had learned to roll with the small victories. "Thank you, sir," she mumbled under her breath, while pulling one of the thick chains tightly around a stack of crates before securing it with a heavy lock. The sturdy metal clicked loudly into place as she smacked the shackle down a bit harder than she strictly had to, fastening it into the locking mechanism. Taking the chain into both hands, she pulled on it strongly, testing it for any obvious weaknesses that would compensate the cargo. The metal clanged and strummed under the tension, but it held on tight. Satisfied, she let go of it with a sigh, and then stood up to turn towards her supervisor. Although, before she actually fully acknowledged him being there, she lifted the personal assistant on her wrist up to her mouth. "This is Ship and Cheetah," she announced over an open communication line directly to the bridge. "Cargo area is secure for deceleration, ma'am." She pulled it back slightly to look down at the softly glowing screen while waiting for an answer. It took a few seconds, but finally a message arrived with a soft ding. "Good work," it read. "Your help won't be needed anymore. You may return to your supervisor for further instruction." After her eyes had glided over the message, Cheetah let her assistant sink down with a soft sigh, before clearing her throat and looking up at the warrant officer. Snapping into stiff, motionless salute, she greeted him. "Reporting back. Preparations for deceleration are finished. Awaiting further orders, sir." She decided to pretend like he hadn't been standing there the whole time. She didn't know why he had come here to gawk at her doing basic manual labor, and at this point she had gotten tired of asking these questions. By now she had reached the conclusion that Rook Tuzma simply didn't have any work or duties of his own, and the entirety of his day was spent with waiting for opportunities to show up wherever she was to comment on her work. "Good work," Rook Tuzma replied, and looked her up and down. His already narrow eyes narrowed further, as they tended to do every time he was inspecting her for whatever reason. He lifted one of his long, awkward arms to run his hand along the side of his face, although he avoided it to cover even one of his ears at any point. Finally, his hand ended right over his lips, which he pinched with two of his fingers for a second as he contemplated something. "Now go get yourself cleaned up," he ordered, after a way too long pause. "I need you presentable later." Cheetah almost automatically complied to the order, ready to use any reason to get away as she usually did. "Yes, sir," she began. However, she stopped short once it had sunken in what he was actually asking of her there. Her brows furrowed and her ears stood up suspiciously. Sir," she hesitantly began, and kept a tight watch over her supervisor's face. "The deceleration is about to begin." Rook Tuzma let out an annoyed clicking sound. "Yes, I am aware, shipman," he replied, sounding rather unwilling to discuss the topic. Still, Cheetah had to be sure she actually heard him correctly. "Protocol would be to congregate in a common area while the private chambers are sealed, unless currently carrying out orders relating to the docking process," she explained. Not that Cheetah was a stickler for rules exactly. Quite the opposite, in fact. However, blatantly disregarding docking protocol wasn't exactly just a minor bending of a general guideline. Rook Tuzma's face darkened slightly, looking rather displeased about having to explain himself. "Yes," he said, running his hand across his face once more. "And I gave you an order, didn't I?" That much was true. She would be carrying out an order, but would that fly as an excuse should she be caught? She'd have thought about it hard, her tail gently swaying through the air to give some release to the tension within her. Was this an order she should outright refuse? She did feel like it was breaking protocol, so she technically had the right to do it. Then again, it would get her in bad graces with the man directly giving her orders, especially if it came out later that this was, in fact, perfectly acceptable as an order here. What to do? "Sir," she finally said, remembering one adage that she had often read while studying military work back on Dunama. Granted, those books weren't exactly about work in the communal fleet, but she still felt like she could apply some of the things she learned there here. "Could I, maybe..." get that order, written down? Ruktursma tilted his head in such a sudden movement that Cheetah thought he had hurt himself for a second. Written down? He asked, in a mixture of surprise and suspicion. Cheetah nodded, biting back her apprehension and replying with a loud and forceful voice. Yes, sir, she announced. I like that order in written form as proof that I was actually given it. Her salute got even stiffer, and she avoided eye contact with the primate as she waited for his reply. She didn't think it was possible, but Ruktursma's eyes narrowed even more than they had before, to the point where she wasn't sure if he could even see anything through the tight slits anymore. His dark face moved in slight agitation, micro-twitches running across it as the gears behind his forehead worked. She'd already steeled herself for the dressing down that was surely to follow now, but after a few seconds, the warrant officer's features softened again. His eyes opened fully, and she could have sworn that there was a slight twinkle in his gaze. In fact, his entire demeanour seemed to light up just a little bit, and he stood up a bit taller as he announced, Ah, yes, I see. Yes, very good, Shipman. I shall send it to you immediately. He lifted his other arm that was housing his own personal assistant, and began to tap away at his screen as he wrote out the simple message containing her new task. A very wise decision to try and avoid conflict, he commented while he was writing. It seems you are learning. Very good indeed. Avoid conflict? Well, that was one way to put it. She just wanted to be able to point towards him in case she was called without him having the opportunity to deny it. Although technically, that was avoiding conflict, in a way. At least security or higher officers would be a lot more likely to look the other way if she could show that it wasn't actually her decision to break the rules. The soft ding of Ruktursma's message arriving rang out from her wrist, and she quickly checked the message to see if it was actually what he claimed it was. Finding the orders just as he had given them earlier, she nodded. Yes, sir, she announced, pretending like the written words had been spoken. You are dismissed, Ruktursma said, and waved for her to leave with his long arm. Cheetah didn't need to be told twice and quickly hurried away. Unlocking her cabin door again after sealing it earlier, even though the deceleration hadn't completed yet, certainly felt strange, but she had express orders to do so, so she just shrugged and took her time. In a moment of morbid humour, she imagined that today of all days might be the one time during her many years on the ship when something actually went wrong during the docking process, and that she would later be found by some patrolling security, wet, naked, and pinned under her own sanitary unit after it had been dropped on her by some turbulence right after she finished her shower. Right now, the thought was funny. It probably wouldn't be funny should it actually happen. After all, protocols were technically in place for a reason, even if Cheetah had never personally seen them be necessary. But she would worry about that when the time came. Though, as an added bit of security, she decided not to remove the metal restraints holding the unit down as she slipped inside, opting to rather crawl and climb over the chains and into the cabinet, instead of removing them and having to reapply them later. Speaking of later, since her orders were to get cleaned up so she could be representable later, she opted to take her time here. The orders were vague enough to allow her to do that, and any long pause she could take from being around Ruktursma was a welcome one. The warm water gently massaging her sore muscles didn't hurt either. As she stood there, and water harshly rained down on her, she could already feel how the pull on her body gradually got weaker, and out of superstition alone she braced herself against one wall of the unit with one arm, just in case something would happen. But nothing happened. And ultimately, all good things must come to an end at some point. She couldn't just stay in the shower until she shriveled away into nothingness, so she eventually crawled out of the unit again, after letting herself be blown dry by the hot air function. Crawling out took significantly more effort than crawling in did, even despite the now much lower gravity, but she ultimately managed to do it, only to find herself standing in front of her just as chained-up closet. Right, that was a thing. For a spiteful second filled with pure annoyance, Cheetah actually contemplated skipping getting dressed and showing back up to her supervisor naked, just like he had so often suggested her do. After all, he did want her to look presentable. But as much as she would have liked it to be a grand gesture of spite, she knew it wouldn't have that effect. And the brief moment of satisfaction it would give her wouldn't be worth the discomfort she would feel the rest of the day because of it. So she got over herself and went through with the few seconds of work it would take to unchain her closet, take out the clothes she would need, and then immediately chain it up again. Dropping her old set of clothes into the cleaning chute with a sigh, she made sure that her new uniform was sitting properly and smoothly, deciding her new way of spite would be to look as absolutely spotlessly presentable as possible in her uniform. "Shipman Cheetah reporting for duty," she said once she found herself back in front of her supervisor. Once again, she added silently in her mind. Rook Tursman nodded as he inspected her. Also yet again, and Cheetah wondered for a moment if he still contemplated telling her that she would look more presentable without her protective clothing. By now, it had stopped being irritating to her whenever the topic came up. She had opted to entertain herself by simply imagining how horribly inappropriate such a suggestion would be if it was made by an officer of the military back in Dunama. Well, how even more horribly inappropriate than it already was. However, it seemed today she was spared any lectures about trying to fit in, as her supervisor simply nodded once again. "Follow me," he then said, and began to make his way through the ship. In her mind, Cheetah went over the places he could possibly be leading her to as she followed, constantly minding her own steps so she wouldn't threaten to overtake him. Especially in this pitiful gravity that remained after the deceleration. The cabins were the other way. So was the research wing and the bridge. Electrical would be this way, although Cheetah didn't quite think that she would have to look presentable for a bunch of maintenance workers, who were likely full of the grime of work themselves. Maybe medical, also unlikely. The more gravity-vulnerable people would be gathering there at this point, which none of them belonged to. What did that leave? To Cheetah's surprise, they soon quickly turned two corners one after another, changing the corridor they were walking down, and Rook Tursma stopped us as soon as they had left the connecting paths behind them. There in front of them, where usually just another hallway would have been, one of the walls had opened up and now led out of the ship and into the long tunnel-like ramp connecting it to the dock. In front of that dark opening that might as well have been a pathway straight into the underworld, when going by looks alone, a good number of crew members stood around and waited in small, separate groups, while security personnel leisurely walked around with their assistants raised, seemingly organising the whole ordeal. Of course, she didn't know exactly what was going on here, even if she had rarely taken part in it herself. "Sir?" she asked her supervisor, who had come to a full stop at this point, and her ears flicked up in his direction, while her gaze slowly wandered across the waiting crew, many of whom eyed her with the typical suspicious looks. "1 second, shipman," the primate announced, and he clearly looked around for one of the security people who wasn't all that busy. Finding his pick, he indicated for Cheetah to wait right here with a movement of his hand, before he walked over to the Estaxi, who looked down at his assistant with a bored expression. Rook Tursma approached the man and waved him closer, talking to him quietly, clearly intending his words for the man alone. However, apparently he hadn't quite anticipated Cheetah's capabilities when making that plan, because she could hear every word. "We have a shuttle waiting for us," Rook Tursma whispered to the Estaxi. "So we'll just be going now if that's okay." Going? Going where? A shuttle? The security man briefly checked something on one of his lists, while Cheetah wondered what the meaning of this was. Then he nodded towards Rook Tursma and gestured towards the ramp, indicating that they wouldn't have to wait for the next group to leave. Cheetah made sure to wipe the contemplative expression from her face, as Rook Tursma turned to approach her again. It was probably better that she hadn't heard what had been said, at least to her supervisor's knowledge. "Follow me," the primate simply ordered again, barely stopping to wave his arm in her direction. Then he was already turning to walk towards the ramp and off the ship. Cheetah hesitated before running a few steps to catch up with him. "Sir, I usually stay behind to help out on the ship while we are docked," she explained, as she slowed down again once she had reached his side. She had tried going out on every station they docked at in the past. The experience had not been great, and ever since she had opted to simply enjoy the time that the ship was mostly empty by spending it with some relaxation in between minor work and the skeleton crew. And she hadn't really intended to break that tradition now, so I didn't request any leave. "You're not on leave, you're accompanying me for a task," Rook Tursma replied sternly, without slowing his steps. "Don't expect that you can just goof off because we're not on the ship." She didn't like this, but, well, she wasn't on leave, and orders were orders. This time she didn't even have any plausible reason to deny them. "Yes, sir," she said with little enthusiasm. "What was that?" Rook Tursma asked strictly. "Yes, sir," Cheetah repeated, with pretended eagerness. Soon after, they sat in a shuttle heading for the station, Lectazra Station, a station on the outer rim of what was considered the core worlds. Cheetah had only been there once. The atmosphere in that place was strange. As they had traversed the dock, she had obviously gotten many looks again. This place didn't see a lot of Deathworld traffic, and obviously especially not from Miat. She didn't know what she was here for, just that she would be accompanying Ruktusma, who was a core worlder. Still, that didn't mean anyone here was giving her the benefit of the doubt, not even in her communal uniform. Ruktusma seemed to have little desire to enlighten her about the business they had here, and since she would be alone with him for a while without much chance of getting away anytime soon, she decided it would be better for her sanity not to catch his ire if she could help it. Maybe she would manage to get through their entire stay without even saying a word. The purpose of their task didn't exactly become much clearer as she watched Ruktusma go about it either, but it seemed to be some sort of errand. One after another, they visited some semi-important looking buildings, only a few of which were well described enough that Cheetah could instantly tell what exactly they were. One was an embassy of Tshirt. One seemed to be the office of the station leader. One was a communal military outpost. And another was something called Primate Council. At each location, somebody was already awaiting their arrival. A quick glance at their identifiers showed that each of them was another warrant officer, like Ruktusma himself. None of them introduced themselves, and neither did Ruktusma, leading Cheetah to believe that they all may have already known each other, since proof of identity was not required. However, Ruktusma was so gracious to quickly introduce her with the words, "And this is my new apprentice, Cheetah," whenever requested. Cheetah held her tongue, even though she wanted to point out that she wasn't an apprentice anymore. She decided to simply report it later. He knew her rank, and addressing her properly really wasn't too much to ask for, but calling that out right in front of his colleagues likely wasn't the best way to go about that. At least if she didn't want this to end ugly. The other warrant officers generally barely acknowledged the introduction of her presence anyway, going quickly about their business of handling Ruktusma a binder with what looked to be paper reports or something similar. Physical paper reports, which the Primate stored away in a little attaché case he was carrying. Cheetah had absolutely no idea why they were running around collecting physical reports, when the same data could have literally been sent to them at the speed of light without issue, and slowly but surely, the urge to ask about the sense of all this grew. And she would. Later. For now, her desire to not say a word during this entire trip was still stronger than her curiosity, especially since that could be satisfied at a later point. Finally, after presumably hitting up every location he had to on the station, Ruktusma announced that they would be returning to the ship now. Cheetah suppressed the urge to take a relieved breath, and already she had hoped there wouldn't be any more excursions like this one. Maybe she should request leave at this point, but not to leave the ship, but to remain on it unbothered. She ruminated on the idea as she wordlessly followed her supervisor on the way back across the station. She didn't pay much attention to the way they were walking, mostly because she didn't have to do any of the thinking herself here. However, on a subconscious level, she did notice the noise around them somewhat dying down over time, as less and less people were in their general vicinity. Apparently they were using the path less travelled here. Cheetah passively acknowledged this. Not that it mattered. At least, she thought it didn't. Until there was a new sound entering the mix. Someone was breathing heavily behind them. Inadvertently, Cheetah turned her head to look who it was. She didn't have a specific reason to do it. Her instincts just told her it was a good idea. And before she had even fully turned, she suddenly found herself staring down the barrel of a gun. She froze completely in the movement, even her ears and tail coming to an absolute standstill as the weapon pointed at her face. Only her slowly constricting eyes alone still moved, as they followed the fall of the gun, back towards the arm holding it and then up to the face of the person trying to threaten her. The face was obscured by an opaque mask that was strapped over it with tight bands. However, Cheetah didn't need to see her face to recognize the species she was dealing with here. Short stature, sand-colored fur, large pointy ears that looked bigger than the rest of the head, and an increasingly bushy tail sticking out at the back of the simple worker's apron, covering their body loosely. This had to be a Lachaxet. A Deathworlder, Class 2. Extreme and unstable environmental conditions, and hyper-competitive evolution. These Vulpines were generally known for both their intelligence and confidence. This one, however, seemed to have made some bad life decisions, and he seemed all the more nervous for it. "Yeah, that's right," he mumbled, as he noticed that she was staring back and forth between him and the weapon he pointed at her. He sounded out of breath, although he didn't seem to howl from exhaustion. "Don't you move a muscle." His hand shook as it was holding the firearm, clearly not comfortable in holding it. She had gauged her options. Sadly, she didn't have a weapon of her own with her. If only someone had told her that she would be leaving the ship a bit earlier. Then she may have thought of bringing it along for her mission. Only now did Rook Tuzma realize that something was happening behind him, and he now also turned around. Other than Cheetah, his weapon was fastened securely to his hip, and seeing what was happening, he reacted quickly, but not quickly enough. The Lakchakset turned his arm before the primate could draw his weapon, aiming it squarely at the warrant officer. "Don't even think about it," the Vulpine ordered, much shriller than he probably intended to. The large towel that was almost as big as the rest of his body waved agitatedly. Then he gestured downwards with the barrel of his weapon. "Just put down the little briefcase of yours, and no one has to get hurt." Rook Tuzma's face darkened as he studied the Deathworlder with the same narrowing eyes he usually showed when looking at Cheetah. "I wouldn't even think about it," he said, and his hand sunk down onto his gun despite the weapon pointed at him. Seeing this as a threat, the Lakchakset released a shot, most likely to show that he was serious. The slugger's massive projectile buried into the ground next to the primate's feet, and made him instinctually pull his hand back again. "I said don't!" the Vulpine screamed, before bringing his gun's barrel up again. He was laser-focused on Rook Tuzma. Lakchakset's eyes were tightly anchored in their skull, and couldn't move on their own, so the Deathworlder had to move his entire head if he wanted to look around. Cheetah decided to use that to her advantage. However, sneaking anything past the man still wasn't easy, because as soon as she took a step towards him, she shot around to threaten her once more. "And I told you not to move," he yelled, pointing the gun at Cheetah's face and stopping her in her tracks. Still, she had gotten closer. That was enough for now. And their attacker quickly had to turn back to the warrant officer, if he didn't want to give the primate an opportunity to draw his gun as well. "Put down the briefcase," he ordered again, to which Rook Tuzma still didn't move. The gun pointed at him seemed to bother him little. "No," he said, gaining the Deathworlder's wrath even more than before. Cheetah took this as a sign to take another step forwards. Of course, their attacker immediately turned towards her again. However, he seemed to know that this strategy wasn't going to last forever, so he changed it. "Hands off your gun or I'll shoot her," he announced, now firmly keeping his gun pointed to Cheetah. Not good. Really not good. If Rook Tuzma was possibly willing to get shot over this briefcase himself, then she had absolutely no doubt that he would have no problem sacrificing her safety in exchange for it. And she was so close already. She just needed one more step. Contemplating her options, she looked down at the gun again. Should she risk it before the primate did? Apparently, the Vulpine didn't like her contemplative gaze at his still quivering hand. Perhaps his own lack of confidence was getting to him. "What?" he asked loudly, and waved his gun around slightly. "You think I won't do it?" And threateningly, he took a single step towards her. Mistake. Lakchakset reacted to things about a quarter second after they happened. At this distance, Cheetah needed far less. Before the Vulpine would have even seen her hand twitch, his weapon was torn to the side. A shot loosened from his barrel, but only after it was already uselessly pointed at a wall. At the same time, in a second swipe that was just as fast as the first, the claws on Cheetah's other hand shot upwards. His light body offered little resistance to the dense weapons created for much tougher creatures, and like sharp daggers they cut through the exposed flesh around his upper chest and neck, blood gushing out of the deep wounds immediately. With a firm twist of her other hand, she then forced him to drop his gun. She didn't see his face, but she could imagine the shocked expression on it, as the Vulpine slowly raised a hand to press it on the deep wounds that now oozed out his life essence on his chest. Then his second hand joined the first, while their owner stumbled back a few steps, staring at Cheetah's face and bloody claws thunder-stricken. He stumbled, one more step, then one more, leaving behind a trail of blood. She'd have thought that he would fall at first, but he too came from a planet where survival didn't come easy. Falling was death, running was life. And so he ran, turned on the spot and sprinted in the other direction, his disproportionately strong legs carrying him like the wind. Despite his injuries, he was fast. Truly he was. But it didn't matter. He wasn't faster than her. Her weight coming down upon him, she'd have tackled her fellow Deathworlder to the ground, taking hold of his arms, while he pointlessly struggled against her. Like that, she waited. The Latchexette tried to speak, tried to tell her something most likely, to reason with her. However, he didn't have the strength for it anymore. Couldn't form the words in the communal language that was so alien to his throat. And so he spoke in his own, that Cheetah didn't understand. Softly and weakly he babbled on, until security came to the two of them. When Cheetah turned to look, Ruktusma wasn't there anymore. However, since she was barely questioned, it seemed that he had at least talked to security either before or when he had left. They took the Deathworlder away, dismissing Cheetah with a couple of quick words, and leaving her to walk back to the ship alone. And there, when she arrived, there was a message already waiting for her. Ruktusma would no longer be her supervisor. So, if you push this one in, these two pop out, Reprie explained, turning the barrel slot, or how the community uncreatively called it, the Tashard sphere, in his hands, demonstrating how pressure on the one rod sticking out of the metal sphere will cause others to come loose on different parts of the puzzle. Depending on which rods are in and which are out, you can turn different parts of the barrel slot, and thus bring the rods into new positions so they behave differently from then on. The end goal is to have all rods pushed in at the same time, and for the button at the top to be visible. Quickly, he pushed in one of the rods that had come out earlier, twisted one side of the sphere along its axis, and then pushed in the other one. Repeating this process a couple of times in a specific pattern quickly yielded the previously described end result, with a single prominent button popping out at the top. Easy as that, he explained, and tossed the sphere up in his flat hand a couple of times before catching it, and handing it over to Havity. Havity took it off him and inspected the, for her, very small item in between her many flexible arms with elation in her eyes. "Wow!" she cheered, in a happy strum of high strings. "You're really good at this!" Reprie waved her excitement off with a flat hand. "This is a really easy one," he explained casually, and leaned back slightly, tearing his eyes off the colleague who was still playing with the ball and bringing them around to the door on the other side of the street, because he felt like he had eyes on him for a second. "I think we got movement," he explained, causing Havity's attention to immediately pull away from the puzzle in her hand as she followed his gaze. Soon it became clearer what Reprie had felt. The door had opened ever so slightly, and a small head tentatively came poking out. First only a little bit, then a bit more. Admittedly, Reprie had to hold back an urge to retch, as more of it came into view. The face itself wasn't anything special, at least for a Latchexette it wasn't. Round face, huge ears, flat snout for a canine, small nose, and green eyes that looked like green marbles implanted directly into the face, without any white or black in sight. Well, that last part was at least what the face should have looked like. However, what wasn't so normal was the addition to it that had clearly been made artificially. Because instead of one of the green marble eyes, one half of the face showed a horrendous yellow replacement, surrounded by rust-red metal. The abhorrent disfigurement glistened in the station's light, while the Vulpine moved her entire head as she looked around the street nervously. Reprie wanted to say something to Havity, wanted to make his disgust at the sight known. However, he knew better. She would hear him. Those big ears weren't just for show, even from this distance. So he was silent and simply watched, as the figure slowly emerged from the door and started to quickly hurry down the street. However, deep down, another feeling pushed itself through his disgust. Victory. "Well, I better get going," he announced, pushing himself back from the table and standing up. "You can keep the sphere if you have the bill." "Always me," Havity lamented, playing along with his alibi. "But fine, it's not like I'm spending my paycheck on anything else." Reprie pretended to thankfully nod at her as he hurried away. "You're the best," he yelled out, as if needing to get it out without slowing down. And then he was on the pursuit. Luckily, Staying out of her lachesis sight was exceedingly easy, given that they needed to very obviously move their entire face in order to look around. Of course, that was usually compensated for by their quite amazing hearing. However, Reprie could keep his distance just fine, so he wasn't very worried about that either, unless he suddenly started to make a lot of noise while walking. Understandably, the Vulpine's visage earned her a lot of disgusted looks on the street, and most people gave her a wide berth whenever they would cross her path. Reprie shook his head. He couldn't imagine why someone would willfully do something like that to themselves. Didn't being a Deathworlder make her enough of a social outcast already? Did she really feel the need to completely eliminate every chance she had of ever fitting in, just for slightly better vision? He was sure she would have been just fine with one eye. She barely relied on her sight anyway, after all. And it wasn't like that horrible thing on her face looked any better cosmetically than a missing eye would have. Still, she had decided that she needed to have it, and now she was earning the price for it. Reprie just couldn't understand such foolishness. Given the fact that nobody was willing to stand in her path, the four made it through the streets quite quickly, to the point where Reprie would actually have had trouble keeping up if he had needed to pay any more attention to staying hidden properly. However, ultimately, he also needn't have bothered, because the four had gone straight home. He already knew the hotel. He had been here many times while observing her during her stay on the station, and finally it had paid off. Immediately he activated his assistant. She went straight home, he explained over the open line. I'll stick around for a bit to see if she comes back out, but I suspect she's going to hunker down for tonight. Good work, oh mighty Deathworlder, HFY replied with a giggle. Don't call me that, Reprie replied with an annoyed sigh. He knew she didn't use it as an insult, but the novelty of that had quickly worn off over the time they had worked together. By now he simply didn't want to normalize that designation for himself, not even meant it in an amiable way. What's the state on your side? HFY giggled mischievously. Your research was golden, she announced, sounding both happy and proud. It was just as you said. The whole building seems to be a front for secret cybernetic business. We have more than enough to bust the entire thing wide open. Reprie nodded in satisfaction. Good, he said. We can't have scum like that running around among good citizens. Bad enough that some will perform atrocities like this in the first place, but doing it in secret as well and trying to dodge the consequences? That's low, even for people such as them. Besides, I don't even want to know the kind of corners they're cutting in safety and hygiene. He resisted the urge to spit on the floor, given that he was on the hallowed ground of the GCS. Instead, he just aggressively licked his trunk to give air to his agitation. Right you are, HFY agreed gently. Anyway, we've got what we needed. Once you're done there, you can go home for the day and relax a bit. You've earned it. Thanks, Reprie replied. Success to you. Success to you, HFY responded, before cutting the connection. Nothing happened for the rest of the day. Like he had expected, the disfigured Vulpine, after receiving whatever treatment she had needed for the mechanical vileness on her face, remained in her hotel room for the rest of the day, most likely dealing with whatever after effects such a procedure, especially done in secret and without the necessary precautions, would bring with it. And so, Reprie did as he was told earlier and went home himself, deciding to take a night of real sleep today. The last few days, he had constantly opted for half sleep, just in case he was called upon at any moment, a quality that the higher-ups seemed to highly value in his service. Reaching his own hotel room, he did what people usually did when they relaxed. He showered, ate some food, and quickly threw himself onto his bed. As he lay there, slowly drifting off, the assistant on his nightstand suddenly let out a brief alarm. It wasn't the one informing him of incoming calls, and it also wasn't the one signifying new messages. Curiously, he picked the gadget up and activated its screen. Then his eyes widened. Emergency news. Explosion on the GCS. 1 dead. So far, no reported injuries. More at 9. A large pop-up message read across his entire screen. The headline was accompanied by a picture and Reprie recognized it. That was the door. That was the building. Oh no. Immediately he shot up and brought the assistant around, frantically calling his contact. Come on, pick up, he thought, as HFY left the call ringing for an uncharacteristically long amount of time. He could feel his heart racing more with every tone, signaling that a connection was being built. Then finally, a voice. Yes, Reprie? Havity asked, sounding awkward and timid, almost like a child that had just been caught doing something naughty. Thank the well you're right, Reprie let out, immediately collapsing back onto his bed. I saw the news about the explosion and I thought,
Oh, yeah, that,
Havity replied, her voice relaxing now.
I guess that was one way for all this to end. Too bad that someone blew it up before we could expose it, but oh well. Good riddance and all that.
You think it was the guy himself? Reprie asked, slowly coming down from the shock. Is he the corpse? He didn't know why he thought Havity would know that any more than he did. The question just came out. However, Havity replied without missing a beat.
Yup, it's him, she confirmed casually. As to if he was it himself, who knows? I guess the investigation will have to show that. Wouldn't say it's unlikely though, but I don't care all that much. Guess this is a more final resolution to it all. Like I said, good riddance.
Reprie paused. This was strange. Usually Havity took so much pride in her work, especially in seeing it pan out. But now she was just casually dismissing an underground operation just blowing up, right before they would be able to expose it to the world. Weeks and weeks of work had just gone to waste in an instant, and she didn't care all that much? That was very unlike her, and even though she didn't care, she seemed to know quite a bit about it. Quite a bit more than was public. And just like him, she wasn't part of station security. She didn't have access to any more files or press releases than he did. However, she knew who the corpse was right away. A more final resolution? Reprie thought about that for a moment. What would have been the punishment for an underground cybernetical clinic? A fine? A short stay in prison? The loss of a medical license that this person likely didn't have either way? He didn't know for sure, but despite the atrocities committed, he couldn't think of a sentence that would be dealt out for such a crime such as this that felt in any way appropriate for his heinousness. And then the perpetrator would be back out there. Would rehabilitation work on someone like that? Most likely not. Not as long as he thought what he was doing was right. And it was near impossible to convince these people of the opposite. Surely Havity knew all that. She was always so open with people and talked to all kinds of them, no matter how repulsive. She was always the first to make excuses for people, no matter who or what they were. Even the disfigured Lakshasset had only had her pity and never had disdain. She was the one person he knew that used the word Deathworlder without any value attached to it. But now, even she said that this person being gone for the world was a good thing. No one would ever get hurt or hurt themselves while seeking help from that person again. Yeah, Reprie finally mumbled after a while. Good riddance.